For most of us, she needs no introduction. Grace DeRond now has been with the fellowship since the 70s, right, Grace? Mary Elizabeth always likes to tell a story that she walked in here one day back when it was still a yoga center, right, Mary Elizabeth, basically? And she saw this lovely, wonderful couple sitting on the floor, and this wonderful woman was pregnant. That was when Grace was pregnant with Gabe, her oldest son, who now has a child of his own in Richmond. We've become very good friends over the years, and I'm very fortunate to have her as a friend. As most of you know, she's really a loving, wonderful, caring, insightful, conscious person, and that is so good to have her here. She was married to Paul Riccioppo. Many of you know him. I can remember his memorial service here. And what I want to tell you is that she came here to take care of Paul when he was dying, even though they had long not been married, and she was married to Ron. And I told her the other day, I said, oh my gosh, Ron was so wonderful to be that open to do that and have you come here. And then as also, many of you know, she was really good friends with, Martha Rappaport, and she came here to help Martha pass over too. So she got a lot to tell us today, and I'm going to move on and introduce Grace DeRond from the Netherlands, by the way.
Or when I was living in Germany with my first husband, Paul Riccioppo, and my mother sent me a copy of the original Paul Solomon tapes book, which was a compilation of excerpts from Paul Solomon's psychic readings put together by Tom Johnson and Daniel Emanuel. So I immediately fell in love with the material, reading that book. And then when Paul Riccioppo and I went on to live in Israel, I took the book with me. And that's where I found out I was pregnant with my first son, Gabriel. So we decided to come back to America. We had been away 2.5 years. We came back to America, went back to Virginia Beach, where Paul Riccioppo and I had met in 1972 at a week-long conference on reincarnation at the ARE. So when we arrived in Virginia Beach, we went to Anchor Realty, which had a little office on 30th Street, to pick up our keys to our new apartment. And there was a little wooden arrow on the wall pointing up, and it said Fellowship of the Inner Light. And I said, look, Paul, that's the organization from the book. So we went up the stairs, and the rest was history. We attended our first Joy and Worship service in this room on March 2nd, 1975, 39 years ago today. I don't know if it's the exact one that Mary Elizabeth came to. We entered the fellowship about the same time. In those days, the fellowship, as they said, was renting this space from the Aquarian Age Yoga Center, and there were no chairs. It was a gold rug, so we all sat on the floor, and a lot of people would come to service in their yoga clothes, and even some people would drift in from the beach in their bathing suits, and it was just a very relaxed 70s. And during the announcements, that first morning, that first Joy and Worship service for me, Michael McCarthy stood up and asked, would anyone like to volunteer with Paul Solomon's psychic readings, the Paul Solomon source readings? And I was quite timid back then, so I didn't even raise my hand, but I went to him afterwards and said, yes, I'd like to volunteer. So I showed up the next morning at the offices above Anchor Realty, and they gave me this is 1975, they gave me an old tape cassette player and the big headphones with spiral cord and a pencil and a notebook, and told me to start indexing the readings. And that meant listen to a reading and write down words, that I hear mentioned, topics that I heard mentioned. So I pushed play, and I absolutely fell in love. And since then, I'm so moved. I'm still so moved by the Paul Solomon source, and I still work with it today, 40 years later, and I can't not do it. I'm compelled to work with it. Still at this point, I hadn't met Paul Solomon. because he was out of town. In 1975, he used to do a lot of work around the country already. He hadn't gone international yet, but he would go around presenting inner light consciousness and doing psychic readings for people. So while he was out there on the road, he would tell the people about this amazing work that was being done by his organization, the Fellowship of the Inner Light, and this interfaith church that was fulfilling its mission. So these are the words directly from the source about this church. Let it be known that in this place, in this teeming mass of humanity that is this city, there is a spot of warmth and light, a gathering of people who care enough to have time to pray and create a receptive place in which the presence of the Christ might love and dwell. So Paul was out there on the road making us sound really good. We were the Essenes, and we were creating a vacuum into which the Christ could be born. In truth, we were a bunch of volunteers without the professionalism or the skills to create an international organization, and much less manage it and run it. So, for instance, this really happened multiple times. Some days the equipment would stop working, like a tape player or a sound editing machine, and we would all see that as a message from the host of witnesses that surrounds the work that we were not in the right frame of mind to be working with this holy material. So we would close the offices and we would all go home and pray and meditate, so that hoping when we came back the next day we'd be better people, worthy of the work. So we had the naivete of children and the devotion of ascetics. And there were 3 people in particular, Mark, Bob, and Judy, who led the prayer healing service in the attic, which had been consecrated as a chapel. And they met at 9 p.m. 365 days a year. They never missed, the 3 of them. The rest of us would come in and out, but they were there every day, every evening. And they met to pray for the work of the fellowship, for the world, and for the names on the prayer list. And I'd like to read a quote for you that describes the spirit of their work. Devotion is when you love the presence that something symbolizes. Consecration is when you touch the symbol with a devotion. And grace is when your forehead naturally bows to touch it because you love it so much that you are compelled and you can't not do it. And that was the way they worked. Still at this point, I hadn't met Paul Solomon. I did get the assignment of helping move him from one apartment to another. In March 1975, he had to change residences. So this group of prestigious office workers had to go and pack his stuff and move it to the new apartment. And Paul Ricciocco and I were the newbies, so we were assigned to clean up the old place while everybody else got to go to the new place and make it beautiful for Paul Solomon. So I'm actually proud that one of my first tasks in the fellowship was to clean Paul Solomon's toilet. Seriously. So eventually Paul came back to town. And one day I actually saw him down the hallway go from one room to the other. I was just bowled over. I was so in awe of this man who had channeled these readings. So if anyone had actually introduced me to him at that moment, I couldn't have said anything. My first reading from Paul Solomon said that I had much to overcome. A lot of growing to do. So I arrived at the fellowship in 1975 with 2 major handicaps. One, I was motivated by fear, and 2, I was stuck in poverty consciousness. How afraid was I? I slept with a light on until I was 24. And how stuck in poverty was I? The tooth fairy left one of my sons an IOU note. Seriously. So these were my big life challenges. And even though I had been introduced to metaphysics as a teenager by in my household and my family, I was still wrestling with fear and a feeling of lack when I arrived at the fellowship. But the tide began to change in April 1975 when I finally met Paul Solomon and attended my first Inner Light Consciousness class. I know Susan was there. I think Sarah might have been there.
At the French school?
At French school. And life just changed dramatically then for me. Decades later, I still work with these two issues, but along the way, I learned some tools for transformation. I applied them deliberately, and positive change was the result. So I'm a little bit better. So I like to wake up in the morning and look out the window and set my eye on a tree and just say, wow, for the beauty and the life of a tree. There's something so special about trees. And then I set the intention for my day in that way. And I go through the rest of the day deliberately looking for what's working and what's good and what's positive and what I love and what I appreciate. I do that instead of doing the opposite. And the opposite is to go through life resisting what is. If I go through the day believing that someone has done something bad to me, or believing that, checking online to see what's wrong with the world today, what needs to be fixed, which isn't true. The world does not need to be fixed. Or if I'm worrying about money, or if I think something terrible is going to happen, that is resisting life as it is. If I go through the day assigning qualifiers to everything I see, like this is right and this is wrong, and he's good and she's bad, and that company is all right, but that corporation is evil, and that politician is terrible, and that HMO is just like from the devil. The GMO is just from the devil. What I do is I lose my original natural joy, and I block real love, because negativity and real love cannot coexist. Paul Solomon said that the first step in spiritual growth was to get control of our thoughts, because our thoughts are our point of attraction. And Casey said that mind is the builder. Whatever we think about most often is what we are building and attracting. And we only need to look at our lives to see the evidence of what we believe and what we focus on most. We may not be getting what we want, but we're definitely getting what we believe, and that includes everything from wealth to illness. There are a lot of myths about Paul Solomon, and about half may be true. The other half is probably our misunderstanding of his work as a mystic and an occultist. Paul was definitely a human, and he did humanly things. Anybody who knew him knew that. At that first Inner Light Consciousness class in April 1975, I took a look at him and I said, here's a man who's offering humanness in one hand. The same humanness I could find anywhere in any person standing around me. And in the other hand, he was offering, in my opinion, the most valuable gold on the planet. And I decided then nothing would stop me from getting that gold, including all the humanness that Paul Solomon could throw at me, and there was a lot of it. So I went for it. I participated in every class and workshop he ever offered. I got 2 psychic readings, multiple coaching sessions. I was a member of the original Chela group of students. We met with Paul every night for 6 months, culminating in the 40 Days in the Wilderness in 1977. I lived in the Carmel community out in the Shenandoah Valley and ran the children's program and the kitchen. I did the 30-day ashram program and was initiated as a deaconess in the Order of St. Stephen. I still wear the ring, so does Sarah. I lived at Hearthfire Lodge, again out in the Shenandoah Valley, and again ran the kitchen. I co-authored a book on parenting with Paul Solomon. He chose the main title, Feed My Little Lambs, and I chose the subtitle, A Manual on Parenting, because it makes a person say the word Emmanuel. Emmanuel. Nobody knows they're saying it all the time. I edited many fellowship books and was the editor of the newsletter. I was on planning committees of multiple fellowship family gatherings and usually ran the children's programs, including the one in England in 1985. I've served on the board of Fellowship International and the board of this fellowship center. I was administrator of this fellowship center, which was my all-time favorite job in the world. Paul Solomon called me in one day and said, Grace, would you be co-pastor with Tom Baker? And I said, well, I'm not a pastor. And he said, well, we can fix that. So Tom and I were ordained together, and we're co-pastors of this fellowship center. So much fun. I took the first seminary program in 1991, and following that I was Paul's personal secretary, so I got very involved. In all these activities, I never considered myself an actual student of Paul. Not because he wasn't my teacher, but because I didn't believe I was a good student. One evening in 1977, he told a room full of chelas, he said, most people spend their lives trying to figure out what they were born to do, and their focus is on determining that so they can get on with it. But Grace was born knowing exactly what she came to do, and sometimes prefers to go off in the opposite direction and do something else. I thought it was a compliment. So I really wasn't a very good student. Now I like to think that I've moved beyond it. And the evidence is these two books. In finishing The Wisdom of Solomon, which is Paul's lectures and readings, and the primer, which is strictly readings, work readings done for the Fellowship of the Inner Light. Only in finishing them did I begin to consider that I was a student of Paul. And I believe that the smartest thing I ever did in my life was to throw myself onto Paul's path. And I'm so grateful. For the past 2.5 years, I've been writing a book on relationships. It's called Grace Notes, A Manual for Partnering. It's everything I know, everything I have learned. This is a proof. So it's soon to be available. It's not finished yet, almost. It's everything I know about, everything I've learned about relationships from my study of Paul's work, and also Edgar Cayce, Diane Fortune, and Abraham Hicks. It turned out to be a manual for finding great love. And I make the point that my credential for doing that is that my life works well, and I found great love. In other words, I've gotten better at managing my thoughts, and I'm no longer totally motivated by fear or a feeling of lack. I had a good teacher. Paul Solomon was the quintessential teacher of his own, the quintessential student of his own teachings. He set a good example because he was not perfect at it. Anybody who was around him knows that. But he never gave up, and he never quit working on himself. He was the most single-minded, single-focused person I've ever met. He never quit working on himself or on the work of the fellowship. And he never gave up on any of his students, including me. He was the type who would leave the 99 to go find and bring back the 100th at any cost. Any cost. He answered to his primary teacher, the Master of Masters, Jesus Christ. And he had the best ability to not separate those two things. Jesus the man and the Christ consciousness. He knew they cannot be separated, as Solomon said to me yesterday. And Paul knew that better than anyone. He also answered to his secondary teacher, who was Diane Fortune. Paul and Diane were both occultists who were also mystics, servants of the Christ. And they both served the work of the host of witnesses who worship the Master of Masters and are the servants of the Almighty. Neither Paul nor Diane intended for their work to become dogma or to be a memorial to either of them. They hoped their work would awaken humankind's inner light, consciousness of the inner light. Paul's organization is called the Fellowship of the Inner Light, and Diane Fortune's organization, which still exists in London, though she's dead now, it's called the Society of the Inner Light. And the two organizations belong to one divine esoteric order which has existed for eons. If you don't know much about Diane Fortune, I encourage you to study her. One of the greatest things she did was that during World War II, she led her students in a weekly meditation to even during bombings, to safekeep England and the Allies against the threat of the Nazis. And this is one thing she said about that effort. One positive thought, consciously linked to the spiritual force of your divine self, can leaven the consciousness of everyone around you and immunize them from any negative influence. While writing grace notes, I wanted to build a connection from myself to the bridge that exists between Diane Fortune and Paul Solomon, because I wanted them to help me write the book. It's pretty bold, but I went for it. So I made trips to two places where they both had a foothold. First, I went to Glastonbury, England, where Diane Fortune lived and worked until she died in 1946. So on a drizzly gray summer morning, I walked to Glastonbury Municipal Cemetery on a hillside outside the city limits. No one else was visiting, so I had the place to myself. I found her grave, and I sat down next to her with my hand on her gravestone, and I recited aloud the 40 Bihas 7 times. The 40 Bihas is a list of 40 affirmations that Paul Solomon channeled in 1977 while he was driving on the way to the 40 Days in the Wilderness. This is just my opinion. I believe that Diane Fortune gave the 40 Bihas to him in that experience. So saying the 40 Bihas out loud 7 times puts me in a zone, which I love. So sitting there that day, communing with the spirit of Diane Fortune, an amazing being, was just amazing. It was just a highlight for me. The following month, back on the continent, I live in Europe most of the year. So back on the continent, I went to a place called St. Lawrence Kerk. Kerk is the Dutch word for church. St. Lawrence Kerk is a 15th century Gothic church in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So my intention is that I'm still trying to build this bridge between these two beings. So 2 decades ago, one evening in 1987, when I hadn't yet gone to the Netherlands, my present husband, Ron DeRond, who is from the Netherlands, left work at the hospital in Haarlem and rushed to make it on time for a Paul Winter concert in St. Lawrence Kerk. Also on the agenda that evening was an American speaker and author scheduled to lecture on the search for a modern-day mystery school. It was Paul Solomon. So Ron arrived late, the church was packed, so he had to stand in the narthex. And he tells the story that he was too far back and he couldn't hear, he could hear the music, but he couldn't understand what the speaker was saying, but he began to cry from the sound of his voice. So at the end of the evening, he pushed his way forward and managed to make eye contact with Paul Solomon and took his hand and introduced himself. And Paul Solomon looked at Ron and said one thing, only one thing: why don't you come to Virginia Beach? And the next day, Ron, at a workshop, Paul was not present at the workshop, but it was about our book that we had co-authored, the one on parenting, a manual for parenting. Ron flipped it over, saw my photo on the back, and says that he knew I was the one that he would marry. So 3 years later, he came to Virginia Beach, to America, to find me. Lucky me. So 2 decades later, as I sat there in St. Lawrence Kerk, still trying to build this bridge between these two beings, remembering all of this, I again recited aloud the 40 Bihas 7 times, and sitting there that day, communing with the spirit of this amazing man, was a highlight for me. And I believe that I built the bridge and created the connection that I was seeking, and then wrote the book. These kinds of esoteric events and practices are happening on subtler levels. And standing here today talking about it is like trying to explain the unexplainable. They are accomplished by using our subtler senses. And Paul used to say, it doesn't matter whether you believe what I believe. It doesn't even matter whether what I believe is true. It only matters that I live as it is true, because that is how I will get the gold from it. A few weeks ago, I was talking with some of the staff here, and I assured them that the servants of the Almighty, that host of witnesses that has protected and guided this Fellowship of the Inner Light since its inception, which happened many eons before Paul Solomon blew the breath of life into it again in 1972, has not gone anywhere and has not gone dormant. I myself questioned this a year ago, but this year I'm absolutely convinced it doesn't go anywhere. That host of witnesses still has the same purpose today that was consecrated in the beginning. What is that purpose? You're wondering? The Fellowship Primer says it best, and I'll close with these words from the primer. The Fellowship of the Inner Light is first a family, a community of people who share a recognition of God as living love. You are a worship center that is interfaith and non-denominational, not bound by doctrine or dogma. So people of different faiths can worship together here in love and understanding. While the fellowship should be committed to family and worship, never, never should anyone forget the original purpose and the continued purpose, which is the existence of a school. The prime purpose of the Fellowship of the Inner Light is to reestablish the work of the Essenes. The establishment of a community and a school of the prophets, a place of focus and study. You are a place for the gathering of people who want to learn, study, teach, live, and practice living love and ageless wisdom. You ask for a motto. Let this be your motto. God is our prosperity. Living love is our source and our purpose. And we are dedicated to serve and support one another, the planet, and all people in need. And as to the use of prayer healing groups for the healing of this nation, for the healing of the wounds of the world, we have spoken often of the power of prayer among you. There is not a place on earth where there is more power centered than here within this community of Virginia Beach. So, thank you so much.